had a very beautiful community. Hillary Clinton has come out and eviscerated Donald Trump, slammed Biden. And before we look at these two clips, we're going to look at Hillary's clip about herself when David Remnick challenges her about her use of the word deplorable about many Trump voters. And we're going to do it as a reaction to a reaction, because we're going to watch it through the eyes of a political commentator of the younger generation, Kyle Kulinski, who has changed his mind about the use of the word deplorable, and we're going to challenge Kyle. Let's rock and roll.
You were criticized a lot, like probably rightly, for using the word deplorables for many of his followers. But how do you view the evolution of his followers and what it is that they want most of all from him?
Well, first of all, I said only about half were.
By the way, let me just say right now, officially on the record, I owe Hillary an apology on this specific issue. Because I remember criticizing her at the time and saying, look, don't say that, it's stupid, it's wrong. You know, from an electoral perspective, you can still make an argument against it that, like, perhaps it's not the best idea to say that in the sense of trying to win more votes, that, like, you'll get fewer crossover votes to the extent there were any to begin with. But it was 100% correct. Like, at this late date, that is undeniably true. Undeniably true. That, because look at Trump's approval rating today. It's between 32% and 35%. And after everything Trump has done, nah, she's right. That's deplorable. And that's irredeemable. So she was right. I was wrong. And
let's watch
she
a
should
little
double
bit
down
more.
on that aggressively. Half of Trump supporters are fucking irredeemable deplorables. And I could use even stronger terms than that. And I should use even stronger terms than that. But I don't want to get banned.
Well, are you doubling down on deplorables?
But I have to say.
Why is this guy acting like it's a gotcha? She absolutely should double down on it. And you should be ashamed of yourself if you don't agree with her.
Hey, I gave a speech, for example, about something called the alt-right, which, the press had no idea what I was talking about. Certainly the public had no idea what I was talking about. But, I was beginning to see this really disturbing rhetoric, racist rhetoric, sexist rhetoric, the kind of authoritarian, demagogic claims about our politics. And it worried me. So, I tried to kind of put that into the political debate, but I also did try to, draw a line between those who were following him because of that. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a bug, it was the feature. They wanted to follow someone who was, demeaning.
So let's stop for a while. What Hillary is saying specifically here is true. That's to say, when you have post-conservative authoritarians coming to power, they feed off two related instincts. One instinct is a liberatory instinct, the thirst for agency, the thirst for political oxygen, which is actually a thirst that leads people to deny truth. We're in a culture in which for many people political agency is incompatible with truth. And that's a social reality. It's not just a consequence of somebody's intellectual mistake or psychological misguidance. That's not the core explanation. Social forces explain why we've got this conflict. So it's a thirst for agency, but it's also a thirst for the liberation of destructive impulses. And it's not just we're going to throw a giant orange wrecking ball at the system, and that's what it deserves. It's also we are going to, and this is where fascization, fascist ideology begins to come in a little bit into people's mapping of the world. We're going to enjoy the liberation of dark impulses just as an end in itself. Couple of seconds to go.
Obama making claims about me, saying things like, the Second Amendment, people will take care of her. I mean, terrible things that were in that campaign against me, and people didn't take it seriously. People were like, oh, that's just Donald. I'm trying to say, look, I understand there are people who believe that kind of stuff, but most of the people, at least half, who are, following him, they want change. They are not satisfied with where we are in the country. They want, a different economic reality. He's promising all
right.
this.
So, in his commentary, Kyle is sort of saying two things. He's saying that it was kind of prudent for her to not say it, would have been prudent, but also that it would have been prudent for her to say it. But while he is conflicted about that, he isn't conflicted about the fact that it's actually really true. So, because I think it was a catastrophe for Hillary to say it, and an illustration of the very same disempowerment of voters, very same evasion of voters by elites that generated the big Trump vote. Right? It was part of the very problem that generated Trump, that comment. It was a very, very bad comment. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about whether it's actually somehow true, even though it's not politically useful to say it. Here is the problem. In political speech, there is a connection between what words it makes sense to use and what goals you want to achieve. Because politics is not an intellectual argument. It is about cooperation or conflict around a space that you're forced to negotiate. So let's take a ludicrous example. Imagine that you're in Hackney in 2008 in East London, and everybody is called Maya, Laya, and Gaia. And so imagine Maya, Laya, and Gaia go to the wine bar. But then also imagine that it's the only wine bar in the country and that they live together. And so they come in, and Maya and Laya want to drink a beautiful, modestly priced Burgundy from Santonay, and they want to share that bottle for £150, 50 quid each. But then Gaia says, nah, I want to drink a Chateau Rayas, which is going to cost thousands of pounds to order. And Laya and Maya say, well, A, we can't afford it. B, if we could somehow stretch to it, it would ruin our finances for months. So it's a completely and utterly insane idea. But they are negotiating space together with Gaia. There isn't another bar to go to. There are other tables to go to, but Gaia is still going to be sitting there staring at them and being cross that they didn't cooperate with her completely ridiculous and unrealistic request. And they live together. So they're kind of stuck. There is no way to simply pretend that Gaia doesn't exist, even though you feel she is sort of either sort of wrong or sort of crazy in what she wants. That's politics. There is no way to get up from the table of politics except by going like this. A lot of people fantasize that they can get up from the table of politics by magically disappearing their opponents. But if you magically disappear your opponents in your head, they're still there. And the difference, in fact, is that you're sitting there standing apart from the table going like this, but they're continuing to engage in politics. So there is no way for Gaia, for Maya and Laya to tell Gaia that Gaia is just wrong, because they're not engaged in intellectual argument. They could say that to Gaia if they were in a philosophy seminar and debating what a flourishing human being would order in a wine bar in that situation. But that's not what they're doing. They're actually there, they're sharing a table, they're negotiating space. And so what are they going to try to do if they are feeling that they need to change this situation somehow? They're going to either try to shake Gaia up and say, look, you're nuts, your request is completely mad, or they're going to try to negotiate a situation whereby they get as much of what they want as possible, which means changing Gaia's mind about the wine she wants, but in such a way that she doesn't have a complete strop and ruin everybody's night and everybody's life, right? So they're going to say, well, look, I don't think we can have a Chateau Rayas, but why don't we have a Fonsalette, right? It's almost the same thing. It's wine made by the same people. And why don't we have a white instead of a red? Because it's hot. And so they've now moved her from a wine that costs thousands to a wine that costs hundreds. They've moved her, if she agrees, and they've moved her to a wine that's white and not red, because that's what they prefer, because it's the summer. And they're not in love with the choice, but it's much closer to what they wanted originally, right? And instead of paying 50 quid, they're probably going to end up paying 100 plus quid each. But that's better than the completely insane thing Gaia proposed. And so let's imagine they got her there by saying it's almost the same producer. And because it's almost the same producer, we can have a different color, the color we wanted, not you wanted. But that still is very close to you getting, pretty much what you started off desiring, right? It's a negotiation of space which can't be done in virtue of an adjudication about which request is more and less nuts, because on that basis Gaia would simply be silenced. But you can't silence her because you're in the only wine bar in town, you're engaged in a relationship with of cooperation with her. And that's why it is actually ethically problematic to call Trump voters deplorable. Because it does something bad to you. It somehow violates your adequacy of your relationship with politics. One of the biggest differences between us and the ancient Greeks is that when we think of doing bad things, we very often think about the victim of the bad things. Whereas the ancient Greeks very often thought about what doing the bad thing does to the person who does the bad thing. Right? That thought is completely available to us, right? Think about it in the context of debates about spanking children, right? It's not just the argument that you can traumatize the kid, it's also the argument that no human adult can do that very easily without dispensing inappropriate aggression and being a bit lost in the act, right? It's what the act does to the parent, not just to the child. That thought is familiar to us, right? There's something toxic that thought does to you. And you might say, well, no, hang on, but they are in favor of really destructive policy. Yeah, you can tell citizens to bugger off, but the threshold has to be extraordinarily high, right? Them having a liberation of destructive impulses plus a kind of thirst for political agency that is detached from a practical conception of cause and effect is not enough to dismiss them, I'm afraid. It's not even close to enough. And what you should instead do is realize the fact that these voters are made up of multitudes, to be sentimental, and that there are other sides that these voters have, more constructive sides, which need to be appealed to. So it's an ethical disgrace that you make of yourself when you call them deplorables, okay? That doesn't mean you couldn't call some of them deplorables, but it would be a very, very high threshold. You can't just call millions of people deplorables, even if they dispense destructive impulses, and even if their thirst for political agency is magical. So, Kyle, no. Just no. And I don't know what Kyle's wife, Crystal, would think about this. Maybe she would agree with me, maybe not. But I think she should tell him off if she doesn't agree with him. Let's rock and roll, move on to the second clip. And this is about Hillary eviscerating Trump finally.
Well, you're absolutely right. When I was secretary, it was a constant theme by Netanyahu and his then government, the then defense minister, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister. Mm-hmm. It was relentless. It was a constant push. I remember...
what would he say to you?
What?
What would he say to you?
He would basically say, you need to support us in attacking Iran. And back then, this was, 2009 to the end of 2012, we had more capacity than Israel did on several fronts to do that. And so there was a constant argument that we would have. And I remember one day I was on the phone for hours with Ehud, with Bibi, with others, and they would say things like, our planes are on the tarmac. And I'd say, well, good luck. I mean, great. Why are you doing this? So you would say things.
You're saying you were being played
all the time. All the time. I mean,
by an ally that receives an enormous amount of aid.
Well, of course. And look,
this is an amazing illustration of how we live in the age of the authoritarian populist buffoon. But the buffoon generation is actually dying out, because the 2030s are going to bring us more hard-nosed, irresponsible authoritarians who wouldn't do this, right? So interestingly, for all of the buffoonish qualities of Nigel Farage probably wouldn't have fallen for this the way Trump's fallen for it, right? There is no chance that Orban or Putin would have fallen for this, even though Putin is stratospherically incompetent and detached from reality. So Trump fell for it because he has the mental age of a very small child. And this is centrally to do with his narcissistic personality deformation, but it's also exacerbated by his propensity to have fixations and his propensity to have his impulsivity go completely out of control the older he gets. He's experiencing completely neurodivergent spiraling of control, out of control. And that can often happen to people of the older generation. But then also, narcissism very often gets worse with age. And so we need to be very clear that Trump is spiraling out of control on both of these two interconnected dimensions. The story about dementia is much less central, much less persuasive, even though so many people center it. Is Trump spiraling out of control? Yes, he is. Is Trump experiencing unbelievable cognitive decline, that is of the dementia type? No. Relative to his age, the answer is no. But it's not to say he isn't spiraling out of control. And what happened to him is that he sort of transcended post-truth communication, where he says 17 incompatible things at the same time and saturates the informational environment in a way that makes people feel that nothing is true. But he converted post-truth discourse into post-truth action. So you don't just talk about the world in a post-truth way, you relate to post-truth with a kind of postmodernist relativism. Well, Iran is no more a real item that has a particular shape to me, right, than Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is certainly another person, but he is real in the sense that he is an actor in a theater play that I'm trying to manage with strings, right? He doesn't have the kind of reality that would make you care for him as an independent actor who has concerns about, his own well-being. And the question that we now face is, where is this going? Because on the one hand, Trump is furious and scared about what happened to him in Iran, that he faced obstacles, that the world didn't turn out to be malleable the way he wanted. But on the other hand, he still has a propensity and a sort of irresistible impulsive need to escalate. And so where will this escalation bulge out? Let's look at the third clip now, which is about Joe Biden.
So here's Hillary, and now she comes out and says something that everybody with a functioning brain was saying at the time, but Democratic insiders didn't say it until much later on. Listen to what she says here about Biden.
He made a terrible mistake. He made a terrible mistake for himself, his legacy, and for the country. He had said that he would not run again. And, counterfactual narratives are always a bit tricky. But I believe if he had kept to that plan and said in, say, the late summer of 23 that he wasn't going to run, that he was going to pass, the torch to the next generation, we would have had a real contest. And very sadly, I believe whoever emerged from that contest, whether it was the vice president or a governor or a senator or anybody else, would have beaten Donald Trump.
I think she's probably right. I think it's probably correct to say that like if there was a real election and a real process, then whichever Democrat came out of that would have been stronger and would have probably beat Trump. I think that's probably true. But again, it's interesting.
Yeah.
You're saying this now,
So,
Hillary. Was Hillary out there saying this?
Hillary's answer to that
when
is,
it was clear
we
Biden
did
had
a
to go,
full
but they were
court
still-
press behind the scenes as much as we could to get Biden to go. That answer is just not good enough in the 2020s, in the age of the crisis of trust. it profoundly undermined trust that whatever the extent of this press on Biden, that it wasn't public. My own view, and there's something is in the depths of the internet or YouTube, was actually that the Biden shouldn't have run in 2020, because Biden was already beginning to demonstrate significant cognitive decline, nothing like what happened to him at the end. And in the kind of political age we're in, running was unethical in 2020, let alone in 2024. Biden lucked out because of the public health crisis and beat Trump. But the objection remains that this sort of position should have been made public, number one. Number two, to what extent does this actually not apply to Hillary herself? I think that whatever one's more definite assessment, it's certainly plausible to say that if the Dems had a proper contest running up to the 2024 election, the candidate would have had a greater chance of beating Trump than Kamala did. And I think what Kyle is saying is not implausible, that perhaps they could have beaten Trump. I might have still favored Trump, but certainly the Dems would have had a greater chance and would have done less damage to public trust in institutions. But here is another counterfactual. I think probably Biden would have beaten Trump in 2016, before his cognitive decline set in. And so the same applies to Hillary. It wasn't clear that Hillary was the best candidate, and it wasn't clear that once everybody agreed that she was the main candidate, that Hillary did everything she could in the right way. And this is not just about the deplorables. This is also about something that we're slightly seeing, but only very slightly, thought out in this interview. Because Hillary was like this. Right? She had layers and layers and layers, right, of protective armor. She felt unreachable, and that was trauma. That wasn't actually because she was a cold-hearted operator, even though she is in many ways a cold-hearted operator, and that is in fact what she is. She's not got that kind of resplendent, transformational and big picture directed political genius that Clinton had. No expression of support for Clinton's policies here, purely a statement about talent. What Hillary is a kind of transcendentally gifted hack, somebody who does basic stuff but on the highest level possible, and then even slightly higher than that. So she has a kind of a basic hyper competence, and at that thing specifically, she is actually superior to Bill Clinton. But there was a hardness there, and the hardness was a kind of a preemptive protective shell. And it's that where it's absent, could have got her over the line to beat Trump. What could she have done? Well, quite frankly, if you talk about psychoanalysis, she would have needed probably about 5 to 7 years to shed this, with a very high quality analyst. Could she have had some strategic intervention from somebody? Yes, she could have hired Tony Robbins full time for half a year, but I suppose I'm not sure how sustainable the transformation would be in that case. But he could have worked with her the way he's worked with other people, the way he worked with Conor McGregor, for instance, and seemingly got McGregor out of some patterns, but then he relapsed again. So what's nice about this interview a little bit is that some of that armor is slightly melting down. It's there, but it's melting down a little bit with age, experience, and of course not having to compete in public for great positions of power. Thank you so much for tolerating my take. Lots of love.